The morning of December 10th, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Commander Chester Smith stands in the conning tower of the USS Swordfish, watching through the periscope as a Japanese transport convoy steams through Philippine waters. His crew is silent, coiled with anticipation. They've trained for this moment, drilled endlessly in approach angles, firing solutions, torpedo spreads. The enemy ships are fat with troops and supplies, moving in predictable formation, unescorted. It's the shot every submarine commander dreams of. Smith's calculations are perfect. Range, 1,200 yards. Target speed, 10 knots. Angle on the bow, 90 degrees, a perfect broadside. He orders tubes 1 through 6 made ready. The torpedoman's mate confirms each weapon armed and set to run at 10 feet depth. Smith takes one final bearing, then gives the order. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. The boat shudders as compressed air launches each Mark 14 torpedo into the dark water, 20 feet long, 3,000 pounds, 46 knots, each one carrying 650 pounds of Torpex explosive and the Navy's revolutionary Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder, a device so sophisticated it was classified above top secret, designed to detonate beneath an enemy ship's keel and break its back without even striking the hull. They wait. Smith counts seconds through the periscope. His crew can hear the enemy propellers through the pressure hull, that rhythmic thrum of Japanese diesel engines. 30 seconds. 40. The torpedoes should be reaching their targets. Nothing. Smith watches, disbelieving, as one torpedo passes directly beneath a transport, then another. The magnetic exploders remain silent. He fires 3 more torpedoes. The convoy steams on, untouched, unharmed. 6 perfect shots, 6 complete failures. What Commander Smith doesn't know, what no one in the submarine force knows yet, is that he's just witnessed the opening act of the most catastrophic weapons failure in American military history. A failure so complete, so stubbornly defended by bureaucracy and pride, that it will cost thousands of American lives and nearly hand control of the Pacific to Japan. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To grasp the magnitude of this disaster, we need to travel back to 1922, to Newport, Rhode Island, to the Naval Torpedo Station, where a generation of naval engineers believed they were creating the future of maritime warfare. The torpedo had evolved considerably since its invention by Robert Whitehead in 1866. By the end of the First World War, most naval powers possessed reliable torpedoes that could strike a ship's hull and detonate on contact. But American naval theorists wanted something more revolutionary. They wanted a weapon that could bypass a battleship's armor belt entirely. The 5Li concept was elegant. Instead of striking a target's armored sides, a torpedo would pass underneath the hull. There, it would detect the massive magnetic field generated by thousands of tons of steel. At precisely the calculated moment, it would detonate, creating an enormous gas bubble that would expand upward with catastrophic force. The explosion wouldn't just hole the ship, it would break the vessel's keel, the structural spine that holds a ship together. 1 torpedo, 1 kill, every time. Development of this magnetic influence exploder began in earnest in 1922, led by a team at Newport under Commander Charles Cook. The technical challenges were immense. The device had to be sensitive enough to detect a ship's magnetic field through seawater, yet stable enough to withstand the violent launch from a torpedo tube and the sustained run at 46 knots. It had to distinguish between a target vessel and the Earth's own magnetic field, and it had to calculate the precise moment of detonation, while the torpedo was moving at over 50 feet per second. The engineers at Newport worked in absolute secrecy. The magnetic exploder, designated the Mark 6, was classified at a level higher than most operational war plans. Even submarine commanders weren't told the exact specifications of the device. The reasoning was sound. If the Japanese or Germans learned how it worked, They could develop countermeasures degaussing their ships to reduce magnetic signatures, for instance. By 1931, the Mark VI was paired with a new torpedo design, the Mark XIV. This was a steam-driven weapon, powered by a reciprocating engine that burned alcohol and compressed air. It could carry its warhead nearly 4,500 yards at 46 knots, or extend its range to 9,500 yards at slower speeds. By the standards of the era, it was a formidable weapon. The Japanese long-lance torpedo had longer range and faster speed, but the American Mark XIV had something the long lance lacked: the magnetic exploder. The Bureau of Ordnance BUORD, the Navy Department, responsible for all weapons procurement, conducted extensive testing of the Mark XIV system. At least, they believed it was extensive. Engineers fired dummy warheads beneath target vessels anchored in Narragansett Bay. They measured the torpedo's running depth using stopwatch calculations and visual observations. They noted when the Mark VI detected the target's magnetic field. They calculated theoretical blast effects using mathematical models. On paper, in controlled conditions, in the calm waters off Rhode Island, the system performed beautifully. But there was a problem, a critical, ultimately fatal problem. They never tested the complete weapon system with a live warhead under combat conditions. The reason was purely financial. Each Mark VI exploder cost $10,000, equivalent to roughly $180,000 today. During the lean depression, years of peacetime budgets, the Bureau of Ordnance couldn't justify destroying even one in a full-scale test. They couldn't sacrifice an entire torpedo, an entire exploder, and an entire target vessel just to confirm what their calculations already predicted. So they did what bureaucracies facing budget constraints have done throughout history. They theorized, they calculated, they ran limited tests, and they declared the weapon operational based on mathematical confidence rather than empirical proof. By 1938, the Mark XIV torpedo was in full production. Contracts went to private manufacturers. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport refined production techniques. By Pearl Harbor, the weapon equipped every American submarine in the Pacific Fleet, nearly 200 boats, each carrying 24 torpedoes. That's roughly 4,800 perfect weapons, distributed across the submarine force. The submarine community embraced the Mark XIV with genuine enthusiasm. These were professional naval officers, most of them Annapolis graduates, trained in engineering and physics. They understood the theory behind magnetic influence detonation. They appreciated the elegance of the design. More importantly, they believed in American technological superiority. The United States had pioneered aviation, revolutionized industrial production, and led the world in engineering innovation. Of course, American torpedoes would be superior to Japanese weapons. It was almost axiomatic. Training focused on everything except the possibility that the weapon might fail. Submarine crews drilled on approach tactics, learning to calculate firing solutions in their heads, while managing the complex dance of diving, trimming, and maintaining stealth. They practiced emergency blow procedures for when Japanese destroyers counterattacked. They memorized recognition silhouettes of Japanese ships. They studied patrol routes and learned to read sonar returns. Not once did anyone train them for what to do when their torpedoes simply didn't explode. Admiral Thomas Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet, told his submarine captains in late 1941 that they possessed the most powerful submarine weapon in naval warfare. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, approved war plans that placed the submarine force at the center of America's Pacific offensive. The strategy was clear and, on paper, devastating. Unleash the submarines against Japan's maritime supply lines. Sink the tankers bringing oil from the Dutch East Indies. Destroy the transports carrying troops to garrison the newly conquered territories. Strangle Japan's war economy before its industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. It was a sound strategy. With competent execution and reliable weapons, it might have shortened the Pacific War by months, even a year. The Japanese home islands were utterly dependent on imported resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, food from Manchuria. Every one of these supply lines was vulnerable to submarine interdiction. Japan's merchant marine, though substantial, wasn't large enough to absorb sustained losses. The empire had conquered vast territories, but lacked the maritime strength to defend the sea lanes connecting them. American submarines could have made that conquest worthless, if only the torpedoes had worked. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Arizona burns. The Oklahoma capsizes. The West Virginia settles into the mud. 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet's battleship line is shattered. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrives to take command of what remains. He surveys the wreckage with the analytical calm that will define his leadership throughout the war. Yes, the battleships are gone, but the carriers Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga were at sea and survived. The submarine base is intact. The fuel storage farms are untouched. The machine, shops, the dry docks, the repair facilities, all operational. Most importantly, the submarine force is ready for war. Nimitz embraces a strategy born of necessity. Until the surface fleet can be rebuilt, submarines will carry America's offensive into Japanese waters. The plan is aggressive, even audacious. Rather than wait for the enemy to come to them, American submarines will hunt Japanese shipping from Tokyo to Singapore. They'll operate in enemy-controlled waters, penetrate harbor defenses, and sink everything that floats. The submarine community responds with fierce determination. These men have trained for years for this moment. They're volunteers. Submariners are always volunteers, and they represent the elite of the naval service. Many are Annapolis graduates. All have passed rigorous psychological and technical evaluations. They understand the risks. Submarine warfare is inherently dangerous. But they also believe they possess superior training, superior tactics, and superior weapons. Within days of Pearl Harbor, submarines are deploying on war patrol. They slip out of Pearl Harbor and head west toward Japanese-controlled waters. Each boat carries her full load of 24 Mark 14 torpedoes. Each commander has his orders: sink enemy shipping, disrupt Japanese supply lines, make them pay for Pearl Harbor. The first patrol reports begin arriving in January 1942, and something is immediately, obviously wrong. USS Skipjack, patrolling off the Japanese home islands in late December, encounters a tanker. Perfect conditions: clear water, calm sea, range 1,200 yards. Commander Charles Freeman fires 4 torpedoes. All 4 pass beneath the target without detonating. The tanker steams away, unaware it's been attacked. USS Sturgeon ambushes a Japanese destroyer in the Philippines. 3 torpedoes. One explodes prematurely 400 yards from the target, far too early to cause damage. The other 2 simply vanish. The destroyer counterattacks with depth charges. Sturgeon survives but accomplishes nothing. USS Sargo stalks a convoy for 3 days, finally achieving perfect firing position. 7 torpedoes fired in a carefully calculated spread. 0 hits. Not 0 sinking hits, 0 hits of any kind. The torpedoes apparently pass beneath the targets or run off course. USS Seawolf experiences something even more disturbing. Commander Frederick Warder fires at a freighter from close range and clearly hears his torpedo strike the target's hull. A distinctive metallic clang transmitted through the water. No explosion. The freighter continues on. Warder surfaces later and examines his last remaining torpedo. The warhead appears intact. Everything looks normal. By February 1942, the pattern is unmistakable. Something is systematically wrong with the Mark 14 torpedo. Submarine commanders are returning from patrol, not with victory pennants flying, but with bitter, detailed after-action. Reports describing failure after failure. They describe perfect firing solutions wasted. They describe hearing torpedoes strike enemy hulls without exploding. They describe watching their sophisticated weapons pass harmlessly beneath targets. or detonate prematurely, or simply disappear into the Pacific. The submarine force is hemorrhaging opportunities. Every failed attack means another Japanese ship delivering troops, fuel, ammunition. Every wasted torpedo means another chance for Japanese destroyers to counterattack with depth charges. Men are dying not in the glorious surface engagement they imagined, but in dark steel tubes filling with seawater, crushed by depth charge concussions, drowning in darkness. And here's where the story takes a turn into something almost Kafkaesque, almost impossible to believe. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington doesn't believe the submarine commanders. The official response is stunning in its condescension. Rear Admiral William Spike Blandy, chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, reviews the patrol reports and concludes that the problem is not the weapon. The problem is the men firing them. WWII issues a directive in February 1942 that essentially accuses submarine commanders of incompetence. The torpedoes, the directive states, are performing exactly as designed. The failures must be due to incorrect depth settings, poor approach angles, inadequate fire control calculations, or premature detonation of the Mark VI exploder caused by the submarine's own magnetic field. The Bureau offers refresher courses in torpedo firing procedures. They send out instructional bulletins explaining proper firing doctrine. They remind commanders that the Mark XIV is a precision instrument that requires precise handling. What they don't do, what they refuse to do, is admit the possibility that the weapon itself is flawed. You have to understand the institutional mindset at work here. The Mark XIV torpedo represented 2 decades of research, engineering, and development. Careers had been built on its success, reputations staked. The senior officers at WWII had personally overseen its development. To admit the weapon was fundamentally flawed was to admit that their life's work, their professional judgment, their technical expertise, all of it was inadequate, so they didn't admit it. Instead, they blamed the operators. It's a pattern we see repeated throughout history. When a complex system fails, institutions protect themselves by blaming the humans interacting with the system rather than examining the system itself. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, submarine commanders are approaching a breaking point. Consider the psychological pressure these men faced. They're hunting enemy ships in hostile waters, hundreds of miles from friendly forces. Every approach to a target risks detection. Every attack invites counterattack. Depth charges are brutally effective against submarines. Even a near miss can shatter gauges, rupture seals, crack pressure hulls. The margin for error is non-existent, and they're doing all this with weapons they cannot trust. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Red Ramage of the USS Trout becomes so frustrated with torpedo failures that he begins deliberately setting his weapons to run shallower than prescribed, violating direct orders from WWII, risking court-martial. His reasoning is grimly pragmatic. If the torpedoes are running deeper than their settings indicate, then setting them shallow might cause them to run at the correct depth. It's troubleshooting through insubordination. It works, sometimes. Trout's success rate improves marginally, but Ramage is still operating with incomplete information. He doesn't know why the torpedoes are running deep. He doesn't know about the other failures waiting to ambush him. Commander Dudley, Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo, develops a radically different approach. Surface attacks. If the torpedoes won't work from depth, if the magnetic exploders are unreliable, then Morton will attack like a motor torpedo boat on the surface, close enough to visually confirm hits, firing the Mark 14 seconds as straight-running weapons rather than sophisticated magnetic mines. It's insanely dangerous. Submarines are designed to attack while submerged. On the surface, they're vulnerable to gunfire, aircraft, and being rammed. But Morton's aggressive tactics achieve results. Wahoo becomes one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific Fleet during early 1942, precisely because Morton refuses to fight the way the weapon was designed to be used. Other commanders aren't so fortunate or so audacious. They follow doctrine. They trust their training. They fire their torpedoes according to WWII specifications. and they watch in helpless frustration as Japanese ships sail away unharmed. The submarine force begins to fracture psychologically. Some commanders become hesitant, conserving torpedoes because they can't trust them to work. Others become reckless, firing spreads of 6 or 8 torpedoes at single targets, trying to overwhelm the weapon's unreliability through sheer volume. Still others request reassignment, their confidence shattered, unwilling to take their boats and crews into harm's way with defective weapons. The casualty rate begins to climb. Not just from combat submarines are always lost in combat, but from unnecessarily risky tactics forced by torpedo failures. When your weapons don't work at optimal range, you move closer. When you move closer, you're more likely to be detected. When you're detected, you're more likely to be depth-charged. When you're depth-charged, you're more likely to die. The USS Grunion is lost with all hands after reporting torpedo failures in Aleutian waters. Her last radio transmission describes failed attacks on Japanese ships. Then, silence. 70 men gone. The USS Amberjack goes down in the Bismarck Archipelago. Her patrol reports documented repeated torpedo failures. She was last seen attacking a freighter at close range, probably forced into a dangerous approach by lack of confidence in her weapons. The submariner community is small, tight-knit. These men know each other. Many trained together at the submarine school in New London, Connecticut. They shared beers at the officers' club, played cards, talked tactics. Now they're reading casualty lists and wondering, did their friends die because of Japanese depth charges, or because they were forced to use tactics they never should have needed? And through it all, the Bureau of Ordnance maintains that the Mark 14 is functioning perfectly. June 4th, 1942. The battle that will turn the tide of the Pacific War. History remembers Midway as the day American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed aircraft and destroyed them in minutes. It's remembered as a carrier battle, pilots versus pilots, the new face of naval warfare replacing the old battleship duels. But there's a subplot that history often overlooks. American submarines were positioned as a forward screen, specifically to intercept and cripple the Japanese fleet before it reached Midway's airspace. 12 submarines, deployed in a carefully calculated picket line, with advance intelligence from broken Japanese naval codes, a luxury they would rarely have again. The submarines knew when the enemy was coming, from what direction, with what forces. Every condition favoured the defenders. USS Nautilus, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, achieves what should have been the perfect attack. She penetrates the Japanese destroyer screen no small feat and reaches firing position on the carrier Kaga. Range, less than 3,000 yards. The carrier is massive, moving in a straight line, presenting a perfect target profile. Brockman fires 3 torpedoes. 1 hits. The crew of Nautilus hears the impact through the hull. A cheer goes up. Then, nothing. No explosion. The Mark 6 magnetic exploder fails to detonate. The torpedo apparently bounces off Kaga's hull and tumbles away. Japanese crew members later describe the impact as feeling like being tapped with a wooden stick, hardly the keel-breaking catastrophe the weapon was designed to create. USS Trigger has a similar opportunity. She fires 4 torpedoes at a battleship from ideal range. All 4 run true. All 4 fail to explode. The battleship, possibly Haruna, continues steaming toward Midway, untouched, unharmed. USS Grouper fires a spread at a cruiser. Nothing. The magnetic exploders remain silent, or the torpedoes run too deep, or both. In the end, American submarines at the Battle of Midway fire approximately 30 torpedoes at Japanese fleet units. They achieve exactly 0 sinking hits. Their contribution to the battle is nil. The dive bombers from Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet win the battle without submarine support. Midway becomes an overwhelming American victory, but it's won despite the submarine force, not because of it. And still, the Bureau of Ordnance maintains there is nothing wrong with the Mark 14 torpedo. By mid-1942, the submarine community has had enough. individual commanders begin conducting unauthorized tests, risking their careers to understand what's failing. Commander John Jock Haynes of the USS Growler, operating in the Aleutians, deliberately fires a torpedo into a reef just to observe what happens. It detonates. The exploder can work. But why so inconsistently? Other commanders start sharing patrol reports through informal channels, circumventing the official chain of command. They meet in small groups at the submarine base and compare notes. Patterns begin to emerge. Torpedoes fired in the cold northern waters of the Aleutian campaign seem to fail more frequently than those fired in tropical waters. Why? Is the Mark VI exploder sensitive to temperature variations that weren't accounted for in testing? Torpedoes fired at shallow draft vessels, destroyers, destroyer escorts, even submarines fail at a much higher rate than those fired at deep draft capital ships. Why? Could the magnetic exploder be calibrated incorrectly for different hull depths? Even when torpedoes physically strike targets confirmed by the distinctive sound of metal-on-metal impact, they often fail to explode. Why? Is there a second failure mode beyond the magnetic exploder? These aren't stupid men. They're trained engineers and tactical thinkers. They're identifying multiple distinct failure modes: depth control problems, magnetic exploder unreliability, and contact exploder failure. They're trying to tell Buord that the Mark XIV has at least 3 separate defects, but the Bureau of Ordnance won't listen. The bureaucratic stonewalling reaches its peak in August 1942, when Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarines Pacific Fleet, decides to force the issue. Lockwood is different from most flag officers. He came up through the submarine service, commanded boats himself, understands the weapon systems intimately. More importantly, he trusts his commanders. When men like Morton and Ramage and Brockman say the torpedoes aren't working, Lockwood believes them. He orders a formal controlled test at the submarine base in Pearl Harbor. The test is methodical and undeniable. Fire Mark XIV torpedoes beneath a net tender anchored in the harbor, with depth measurement equipment rigged to track the torpedo's actual running depth. The results are damning. The torpedoes run an average of 11 feet deeper than their depth settings indicate. 11 feet. Think about what that means. A destroyer typically has a draft the depth from waterline to keel of 14 to 16 feet. If a torpedo is set to run at 10 feet depth, it should pass just beneath the destroyer's hull, close enough for the magnetic exploder to detect the steel mass above it. But, if the torpedo actually runs at 21 feet, it passes far beneath the target, too deep for the exploder to register anything. On deep draft targets like battleships or large transport ships with drafts of 30 feet or more, the error matters less. The torpedo might still pass close enough to trigger the magnetic exploder, but on the destroyers and light cruisers that make up most Japanese convoy escorts, the torpedoes are passing underneath entirely, too deep to be effective. Lockwood sends the test results to Buord with a detailed report. He expects immediate action, perhaps a recall of all Mark XIV torpedoes for depth recalibration, or at least an acknowledgement of the problem and authorization to make field modifications. Instead, he gets bureaucratic denial. The Bureau of Ordnance disputes the test methodology. They suggest that perhaps water density in the Pacific differs from water density in the Atlantic, where the original testing was conducted. They imply that Lockwood's measuring equipment might be faulty. They question whether the test conditions accurately reflected combat conditions. They refuse to acknowledge that the torpedo runs deep. It's gaslighting on an institutional scale. Lockwood has provided empirical proof, gathered under controlled conditions, using proper scientific methodology. And Buord simply, Lockwood faces a choice. He can continue arguing with Washington, submitting reports and waiting for bureaucrats to act while Japanese shipping moves unmolested through the Pacific, or he can take matters into his own hands. In September 1942, Admiral Lockwood issues an order that amounts to mutiny. Deactivate the Mark VI magnetic exploder. Turn it off. Use only the contact exploder, the backup detonation system that's supposed to fire when the torpedo physically strikes a target's hull. It's an extraordinary decision. Lockwood is countermanding the Bureau of Ordnance's direct orders. He's disabling the very feature that makes the Mark 14 supposedly superior to all other torpedoes. If his decision backfires, if it turns out the magnetic exploder was working properly and the real problem lay elsewhere, his career is finished. But Lockwood trusts his commanders more than he trusts Buord's calculations. And he's right. With the magnetic exploder deactivated, hit rates immediately improve. Not dramatically, they go from roughly 10% to around 30%, but the improvement is undeniable. Submarines start sinking Japanese ships. Patrol reports become less bitter, less frustrated. Commanders regain confidence. For a brief moment, it seems like the problem is solved. July 1943, nearly 2 years into the war. The torpedo scandal has consumed the submarine force, dominating every patrol debriefing, every tactical discussion, every angry letter to Washington. With the magnetic exploder disabled, submariners are relying entirely on the contact exploder, the Mark 14's backup detonation system. This should be foolproof. It's a relatively simple mechanical device. When the torpedo's nose strikes a target, a firing pin drives forward and triggers the detonator. Basic physics, basic chemistry. There's no sophisticated magnetic sensing, no complex calculations, just impact and explosion. Except it doesn't work. Commanders begin reporting a new pattern of failures. Torpedoes strike targets at perpendicular angles, perfect, textbook hits, and fail to explode. Submarine crews hear the distinctive clang of metal striking metal, transmitted through the water, followed by nothing. The torpedoes tumble away like duds. The USS Tinosa, under Commander Lawrence Dan Daspit, experiences the most maddening failure of the war. July 24, 1943. Tinosa is patrolling near Truk Lagoon, Japan's major forward naval base in the Caroline Islands. Daspit spots a target that makes every submariner's heart race, the Tonan Maru No. 3, a whale, factory ship displacing 19,000 tons. It's not a warship, but it's strategically valuable, a massive floating factory for processing whales into oil, now pressed into military service. Daspit maneuvers Tinosa into perfect position. He's calm, methodical, a career officer who does everything by the book. Range: 1,800 yards. Good firing solution. He fires one torpedo. Hit. Explosion. The Tonan Maru shudders, slows, begins listing, but it doesn't sink. The ship is enormous, with multiple compartments. One torpedo isn't enough. Daspit closes the range, fires again. Hit. No explosion. The torpedo strikes the hull and tumbles away. He fires again. Hit. No explosion. Again. Hit. No explosion. Daspit is methodical, professional, increasingly bewildered. He adjusts angles, ranges, depth settings. He tries everything. The Tonan Maru is barely moving now, wallowing in the water, a stationary target. Daspit fires 15 torpedoes total at a crippled ship from less than 1,000 yards. 15 torpedoes. 2 explosions. 13 duds. The whale factory eventually limps away. It will survive the war. Daspit surfaces Tinosa and contemplates the last torpedo in his forward tubes. He's supposed to fire all his weapons on patrol standing orders, but instead he makes a decision. He saves that last torpedo and brings it back to Pearl Harbor. Find out what's wrong with this thing, he tells the ordnance specialists, because I did everything right and it still didn't work. Finally, the Bureau of Ordnance agrees to comprehensive testing. They mount dummy warheads on rails and drop them from various heights to simulate impact forces. They test the firing pin mechanism under different angles and impact speeds. They examine recovered torpedoes from previous patrols. They conduct the tests they should have conducted in 1935, before the weapon entered production, and they discover the problem. The contact exploder's firing pin is too delicate. When a torpedo strikes a target at a perpendicular angle, the exact angle the weapon is designed to achieve, the angle drilled into every fire control solution, the sudden deceleration causes the firing pin to crumple before it can trigger the detonator. The harder the torpedo hits, the more likely the firing pin fails. The contact exploder only works reliably at oblique angles, where impact force is distributed more gradually. But oblique angles mean glancing hits, which are far less common in actual combat. Submarine commanders aim for perpendicular strikes because those are the most likely to cause catastrophic damage. The torpedo was designed for perfect shots. Perfect shots break it. The engineering failure is almost poetic in its cruel irony. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be sophisticated, revolutionary, superior. Instead, it's been undone by basic physics that should have been caught in elementary testing. The fix is relatively simple. Strengthen the firing pin, redesign the firing mechanism to handle high-impact forces. The modifications are implemented rapidly once the problem is identified. By September 1943, 21 months into the Pacific War, the Mark 14 torpedo finally functions as originally intended. Let's calculate the cost of that delay. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. From December 1941 through September 1943, 21 months. During this period, the submarine force fires approximately 6,700 torpedoes. The documented success rate from patrol reports averages between 10 and 20%, though many submarine commanders believe the actual figure is lower. If we conservatively estimate that half of all torpedo failures during this period were caused by the weapon's defects rather than tactical errors or operational circumstances, that represents roughly 3,300 wasted shots, 3,300 opportunities to sink Japanese shipping, 3,300 chances to cut oil supplies, strand garrison forces, disrupt troop movements. Gone. Wasted. Because the Bureau of Ordnance refused to believe its weapon was flawed, what did those wasted torpedoes cost? In 1942, Japan imported roughly 40 million barrels of oil from the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, and other captured territories. That oil powered the Imperial Navy, fueled aircraft carriers, kept destroyers and cruisers operational. American submarines should have been interdicting that flow from the war's first day. Instead, tanker after tanker reached Japan unmolested because the torpedoes didn't work. That oil eventually fueled Japanese aircraft at Guadalcanal, where Marine Corps aviators fought desperate battles against overwhelming numbers. It powered the ships that transported reinforcements to New Guinea, prolonging the Snight, brutal jungle campaign there. It kept Japanese carrier groups operational through mid-1942, allowing them to threaten Allied positions across the Southwest Pacific. Consider troop movements. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, Japan reinforced its Pacific garrisons, sending soldiers to Rabaul, to the Solomon Islands, to New Guinea, to the Gilbert Islands. Those troops traveled on transports that American submarines should have been sinking. Instead, the soldiers reached their destinations, dug in, fortified defensive positions. When American forces invaded Tarawa in November 1943, they encountered nearly 5,000 entrenched Japanese troops, supported by extensive fortifications. The battle cost over 1,000 American lives in 76 hours of brutal fighting. How many of those Japanese defenders reached Tarawa on transports that sailed past American submarines firing defective torpedoes? We'll never know precisely. But the connection is inescapable. The same calculus applies to Saipan, to Peleliu, to Iwo Jima. Every fortified island that cost American lives was fortified by troops and supplies that traveled by sea. Every one of those supply lines was vulnerable to submarine attack. Every failed torpedo was another ton of concrete, another case of ammunition, another artillery piece that reached its destination and eventually killed Americans. The strategic cost extends beyond individual battles. The Pacific War's fundamental dynamic was industrial, America's vast productive capacity grinding down Japan's limited resources. But that dynamic required time. Time for factories to build ships, aircraft, tanks. Time for training programs to create pilots, soldiers, marines. Time for the industrial mobilization to reach full capacity. An effective submarine campaign from December 1941 onward might have collapsed Japan's war economy a year earlier. Oil imports strangled, food supplies severed. The home islands facing starvation by late 1943 instead of mid-1945. The war shortened by months, possibly a year. How many lives would that have saved? Not just American lives, though those matter enormously. How many Japanese civilians would have been spared the firebombing campaigns of 1945? How many Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, and Malayan civilians would have escaped Japanese occupation sooner? How many prisoners of war in camps across Asia would have survived if the war ended earlier? These calculations are necessarily speculative. We can't replay history with functional torpedoes and measure the difference. But the broad outlines are clear. The Mark 14's failures prolonged the war, cost lives, and gave Japan breathing room it should never have had. Once the Mark 14 is finally corrected, depth control adjusted, magnetic exploder removed or fixed, contact exploder redesigned, the American submarine force becomes what it was always meant to be, the most lethal maritime interdiction force in history. From late 1943 through August 1945, American submarines systematically destroy Japan's merchant marine. They sink 1,178 merchant vessels totaling over 5 million tons. They hunt in coordinated wolf packs, sharing intelligence, coordinating attacks, overwhelming Japanese convoy defenses. The impact on Japan's war economy is catastrophic. Oil imports drop from 40 million barrels in 1942 to fewer than 10 million in 1944 to virtually zero by mid-1945. Without oil, the combined fleet stays in port. Training programs for pilots shut down, there's no fuel for practice flights. Industry slows to a crawl. Food imports collapse similarly. Japan imported significant rice from Indochina and Korea to supplement domestic production. By 1945, those imports have nearly ceased. Rationing becomes severe. Civilians in Japanese cities face genuine hunger. Garrison forces throughout the Pacific are isolated, starving, receiving no supplies or reinforcements. American submarines also destroy 214 Japanese warships, including the battleship Congo, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and numerous destroyers and submarines. These aren't just merchant raiders, they're taking on the Imperial Navy directly and winning. The submarine force, representing less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel, accounts for 55% of Japan's total maritime losses. It's one of the most successful naval campaigns in history. But it's a campaign that should have started in December 1941, not October 1943. So what went wrong? How did an institution that prided itself on excellence, on technical sophistication, on being the most advanced navy in the world, create such a catastrophic weapons failure? The answer is a perfect storm of institutional pathology, peacetime budget constraints, and human psychology. Start with the testing regime. The Bureau of Ordnance developed the Mark 14 during the interwar period, when defense budgets were constrained and every dollar scrutinized. Live-fire testing was expensive. Each test consumed a complete torpedo, a complete exploder, potentially damaged or sank a target vessel. So BUORD minimized live testing, relying instead on mathematical modeling, component testing, and dummy runs. This seems reasonable in peacetime. Why waste money destroying expensive equipment when calculations predict success? But it created a false confidence. The engineers at Newport genuinely believed they'd tested adequately. They'd run the numbers, they'd simulated conditions, they'd observed dummy warheads passing beneath targets. What they hadn't done was test the complete weapon system under varied, realistic combat conditions, different water temperatures, different magnetic environments, different impact angles, different target types. When the war started and the weapon failed, Buord faced a choice: admit their testing was inadequate and their weapon flawed, or defend their work and blame the operators. They chose defense. This is where institutional psychology becomes crucial. The men running the Bureau of Ordnance in 1941 and 1942 were the same men who'd overseen the Mark XIV's development in the 1930s. Admirals Blandy, Christie, Edwards, their careers were built on this weapon. Their professional reputations were staked on its success. To admit the Mark XIV was fundamentally flawed was to admit their life's work was inadequate. So they didn't admit it. Instead, they created elaborate explanations for why the failures must be operator error. They suggested submarine commanders were miscalculating firing solutions. They implied that crews weren't maintaining the weapons properly. They questioned whether commanders were adequately trained. This is a classic bureaucratic defense mechanism. When faced with systematic failure, blame the system's users rather than examine the system itself. It's the same psychology that led NASA to ignore engineer warnings before the Challenger disaster, that led financial regulators to ignore warning signs before the 2008 crash, that leads organizations throughout history to choose institutional preservation over truth. The peacetime budget excuse, while real, reveals something darker. America entered World War II genuinely unprepared in ways that went far beyond Pearl Harbor. The torpedo failure was just one symptom of systematic underinvestment in realistic testing, training, and equipment validation. The military had sophisticated weapons on paper, but hadn't validated them under realistic conditions. Perhaps most damning, the same people who designed the Mark XIV were the ones investigating its failures. There was no independent oversight, no external audit, no adversarial testing regime. The Bureau of Ordnance investigated itself and, predictably, found itself blameless until the evidence became absolutely overwhelming. Admiral Ralph Christie, who'd overseen torpedo development through much of the 1930s, never publicly admitted error. Neither did Admiral Blandy. Both went on to distinguished post-war careers. No one was court-martialed, no one was demoted, no careers were ruined, at least, not among the men who created the flawed weapon. The only careers damaged were those of submarine commanders who'd reported the failures too aggressively, who'd violated protocol by conducting unauthorized tests, who'd modified their weapons without permission. Men like Lockwood survived because they were senior enough and results-oriented enough that their insubordination was ultimately vindicated. But junior officers who'd complained too loudly found their fitness reports suffering, their promotions delayed. The real heroes of this story aren't admirals or bureaucrats. They're the submarine commanders who kept fighting with broken weapons, who adapted and improvised, and found ways to sink Japanese ships despite the Mark XIV's failures. Men like Dudley "Mush" Morton, who pioneered aggressive surface attacks and achieved results through sheer audacity. Morton and WWII became legendary in the submarine force, aggressive, successful, seemingly invincible, until they weren't. In October 1943, just as the torpedo problems were finally being solved, WWII was lost with all hands in the Sea of Japan. 80 men died. How many of them would have survived if their torpedoes had worked reliably from the beginning, if Morton hadn't needed to compensate for weapon failures with dangerous tactics? We'll never know. Men like Richard O'Kane, who served as Morton's executive officer on WWII and later commanded Tang. O'Kane would become the most successful submarine commander in American history, sinking 24 ships. But his success came despite the Mark XIV, not because of it. He fought the weapon as much as he fought the Japanese. Men like Eugene Fluckey of Barb, Samuel Dealey of Harder, George Street of Tirante, all Medal of Honor recipients, all survivors who learned to work around the torpedo's deficiencies through skill and courage. and the 3,500 submariners who died during the war. The submarine force suffered a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any American military branch. 52 submarines lost with all hands. 3,500 men who volunteered for the most dangerous service in the Navy and died in dark steel tubes under the Pacific. How many of those deaths were directly attributable to torpedo failures? How many submarines were lost because their attacks failed and Japanese destroyers counterattacked? How many men died because they had to close to dangerous ranges to compensate for unreliable weapons? The exact number is unknowable, but the connection is undeniable. There's a display at the Naval Undersea Museum in Keyport, Washington. It shows a Mark 14 torpedo, sectioned lengthwise to reveal its internal mechanisms. The steam engine, the gyroscope, the depth control system, the warhead, the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, now deactivated and preserved as a museum piece. Next to it sits a simple plaque with statistics. Torpedoes fired, ships sunk, casualties suffered. The numbers tell a story of eventual success, the submarine force's devastating campaign against Japanese shipping, the strangling of Japan's war economy, the contribution to ultimate victory. But the plaque doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't mention the 21 months of failure. It doesn't quantify the opportunities lost. It doesn't list the men who died firing weapons that didn't work. History tends to remember the victories and forget the struggles that preceded them. We remember Midway but forget the submarine failures there. We remember the submarine force's spectacular success in 1944 and 1945, but forget their frustration in 1942 and 1943. The Mark 14 torpedo ultimately worked. It helped win the war. American submarines proved devastatingly effective once their primary weapon functioned reliably. But it didn't have to be that way. The weapon could have worked from the beginning. The testing could have been adequate. The bureaucracy could have listened to field reports and acted quickly. Instead, institutional pride and budgetary constraints created a 2-year delay that cost thousands of lives and prolonged the war. There's a broader lesson here, one that extends far beyond World War II or even military procurement. Complex systems fail in complex ways. When they fail, institutions face a choice: examine the system honestly or protect institutional reputation by blaming users. Throughout history, institutions have consistently chosen preservation over truth until evidence becomes overwhelming. The Mark 14 torpedo scandal is a case study in this dynamic. The Bureau of Ordnance had every incentive to defend the weapon and every disincentive to admit error. Individual careers depended on the torpedo's success. Institutional prestige was at stake. Admitting failure meant admitting that America's vaunted technological superiority was partly illusory. So they didn't admit it, not until submarine commanders forced the issue through insubordination, unauthorized testing, and eventually undeniable empirical evidence. The pattern repeats. The Challenger disaster, where NASA ignored engineer warnings because launch schedules mattered more than safety concerns. The financial crisis, where regulators ignored warning signs because admitting systematic risk meant challenging the institutions they were part of. Even today, in software development, in medical devices, in infrastructure projects, complex systems fail and institutions protect themselves by blaming operators rather than examining design. The Mark 14 torpedo teaches us that expertise can become arrogance, that theoretical validation isn't the same as empirical testing, that bureaucracies will choose self-preservation over truth unless forced to do otherwise. It also teaches us about the courage required to challenge institutional authority. Admiral Lockwood risked his career by deactivating the magnetic exploder. Commander Daspit risked court-martial by bringing back an unfired torpedo. Dozens of submarine commanders violated protocol by conducting unauthorized tests and sharing information outside official channels. They were right. The institution was wrong. But being right didn't protect them. Only results did. In the end, The Mark 14 torpedo story is about the collision between theory and reality, between institutional authority and empirical truth. The Bureau of Ordnance believed deeply in their weapon because they designed it, tested it, and invested years in its development. Submarine commanders didn't believe in theories, they believed in what they observed through periscopes, heard through pressure hulls, recorded in patrol reports. Eventually, reality won, but it took 21 months, 3,500 lives, and immeasurable strategic cost. The Japanese admirals who planned their great surface battles never got the climactic engagement they desired. American carrier aviation, not battleship gunnery, decided the Pacific War, but in a strange way, the Japanese were fortunate. If American submarines had been armed with functional torpedoes from December 1941 onward, the Imperial Navy might never have reached those carrier battles at all. Japanese fleet units might have been torpedoed in transit. Supply lines might have collapsed within months. The war might have ended before most of the famous battles ever occurred. Instead, because of defective magnetic exploders and crumpling firing pins and torpedoes that ran 11 feet too deep, Japan got 2 extra years to fight. 2 years that cost millions of lives across the Pacific, all because the Bureau of Ordnance couldn't admit its perfect weapon wasn't perfect. The Mark 14 torpedo eventually became what it was supposed to be, a devastating weapon that helped strangle Japan's war economy and contributed significantly to Allied victory. But it's worth remembering that the path to that success was paved with failure, frustration, and unnecessary death. Sometimes the greatest threat doesn't come from the enemy. Sometimes it comes from within, from pride, from bureaucracy, from the inability to admit error until it's almost too late. The men of the silent service learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. They went to war with a technological marvel and discovered they'd been armed with duds. They adapted, they persevered, and they ultimately prevailed, but they shouldn't have had to. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.